Excellent. Thank you for being here today. I'm very excited. This is a brand new presentation for me. So if you have any feedback, I am all ears once we get to the end here. And if you're following along, I'm hoping you have an environment set up, either a Trailhead playground or a dev org or something along that nature that can do these things and not break your production, because that would be very public. And thing about part of what we're doing today is creating an Experience Cloud site. They cannot be deleted. So I don't want you to create them in production and then not be able to get rid of it. So make sure you're using a sandbox if you're following along, or a Trailhead playground or developer org or something that doesn't really matter. I have the chat open, so if you have questions, you can pop them in there throughout. I also have everybody's cameras if you have them on, so I can watch for reactions and stuff. I'm Evan Ponter. I'm from the United States on the East Coast in Baltimore, Maryland, about an hour's drive north from Washington, D.C. I'm an independent consultant. I've been doing this full time since 2020 during the pandemic. I've dabbled in some consulting about a year prior to that, as I had a full-time job at the time. First time I logged into Salesforce was in 2012 as an end user. I became an accidental admin at a small nonprofit and learned about this thing called Salesforce they were using, and I was sort of off to the races from there, learning as much as I could, getting certified, and working at a couple different organizations. I have my contact information here. I also will have it at the end if you want to get in touch with me. And the story today is all about building forms using Screenflow. It's something that I've done a couple times for various clients, and it's something that came up in a couple different consultant groups where they were playing with the idea of, what do we do now that one of these form tools uh, is changing their pricing? And we were looking at other options. So I threw out an option like, hey, I've been having some success building forms using Screenflow. What do you think about that? And it sort of turned, Em and I had a conversation, and it's turned into this presentation. So I want to take you through the steps, just the very basics of how do you get something like this set up? What is it capable of? And there are dozens and dozens of advanced topics we could get into. And once we get to that portion, we will take a poll and understand what is of interest to you. And I can spend a little bit of time talking about that stuff. Here's our agenda today. 4 basic steps, 3 of which are going to be the hands-on portion, and then the advanced part will just be talking about some advanced topics. The first thing we're going to do is create a digital experience site. Now, that might be a new cloud for you. If you haven't worked with it before, digital experience site basically means you can build a website using Salesforce. What's great about these digital experience sites is you don't have to purchase anything in order to use that cloud. Every organization, production org, is granted, and sandboxes as well, everybody is granted a free guest user license. What that means is you can set up a publicly available website where people are not logging in, and you can use things like a flow component or rich text, or there's a bunch of different components available, and you can build a website. So we're going to do some of the basic steps for that. Then we're going to build a very simple form using a Screenflow. So this is collecting input, and we're going to create a record in Salesforce using this flow. The third step here is we're going to add the flow we created in step 2 to the experience site we created in step 1. That's sort of bringing everything together. And I'll be talking a lot about things I've learned about implementing solutions like this, some tips and little gotchas that might come up as you're doing this for the first time. So let's get started. First thing we're going to do is create a digital experience site. Now, I'll say you can set up a single site and use it for all of your forms. You could have hundreds and hundreds of forms. You just need one digital experience site. So let me switch over into my brand new developer edition org. I set this up yesterday. The only thing I've done is confirmed my mobile number. So I'm starting literally from scratch here. So get logged in if you're following along, and get to the setup menu, and we're going to go search for experience. So you'll see it under Feature Settings, Digital Experiences, Settings. First thing we're going to do here is we're going to enable digital experiences. It's just a simple checkbox. We'll check that. This is going to use your My Domain name. This is an update that came out fairly recently. They used to let you specify a domain name here if you didn't have My Domain set up. But all new orgs that are created, this is sort of the default setting. So that's whatever is showing up internally for your Salesforce org. We have other options to mitigate that later. So all we're going to do here is hit Enable Digital Experiences and hit Save. You're going to get one error, or not error, but a warning message here that's saying when you enable digital experiences, it changes record access. In your security settings, you'll see there's like a default external access. Salesforce has, over a number of releases, tried to make that more secure. So this message is saying it's going to change your external access data exposure here. We'll click OK, and we'll let experiences get enabled. It'll take a second, and then you'll see this pop-up message saying, do you want to open this page? I think this is just a relic from when they used to be deploying a domain. I guess technically they are in this case, but this is just like opening the same setup page again. So you can go ahead and click OK on that. So once we do that, our third step of enabling and creating a site here is to set up a new site. So let me walk you through that step. Is everybody with me so far if you're following along? You should be seeing a screen like this. Digital experiences, success, you can now create a site. Give me a thumbs up if you have your camera on. Cool. Let's go ahead and click New. And the first thing it's going to want us to do is choose a template. Now, they throw around a lot of these terms, and I'm going to try to clarify them as we go through this. What you're choosing at this point is something you cannot change later. So it's sort of the framework for how you're going to build the rest of your digital experience site. What I recommend, if you want to start with something very vanilla that you can tweak the colors and the layouts, and you're not going to have anything sort of pre-built for you, I find that the build your own aura, they call template, which I'll call, it's more like a framework that you're building on top of, is sort of the easiest one to get started with. So that's what I'm going to use for the example today, just so there's no other distractions. So choose that build your own aura template, what they call a template. There is a build your own LWR, that's Lightning Web Runtime. That's a newer template framework that they're rolling out. It doesn't have all of the basic components yet. They are releasing them with every release. If you look through the release notes, there's a bunch that came out or they're going to come out with summer 23. I don't feel like it's there yet for relying on having all the normal stuff. So I still like to use this one for now. I imagine after a couple of releases, it'll be better to just switch over and use that new LWR template. Let's get started with this Aura one. And last thing we got to do here is enter a name. And I wanted to point out three things that happen with this name sort of by default. It gets mapped to 3 different places. And you are able to further tweak that name in those 3 places once you get your site set up. So it's going to be the internal name for your site, which you're going to find in the setup menu. That makes good sense. It gets mapped to the site title, which will show up in a browser when somebody visits your digital experience site. Very briefly. Third place that shows up is the name of a profile that is going to get created with your site. This is that guest user license I talked about earlier. There's a profile created for every site for that guest user for the site. What that profile does is it allows you to control the security settings for guest users, like what data can they access, what things can they do on your site. It's very much blank and empty when you first set it up. They have no permissions at all. It is the most secure. And it's true to form with what Salesforce actually recommends, like least permissions available standpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and enter a name for my site. I'm just going to call it site name so that we can see how this gets changed later. You can put anything you want here. You don't have to enter anything after the URL here. If you wanted to do like your site is going to be at this domain slash something, then you could put that here. That URL you can change later, so you don't have to stress about this too much. Go ahead and click create. This takes a few minutes. And while that is spinning, let's take a look at what we'll get into next. So there's a couple settings we need to do in order to take that site and make it publicly accessible. Again, this is something you only need to do one time, but we're going to get into the builder here in a second. Once our site has been created, we're going to enable public access. So this checkbox in the settings here lets guest users see and interact your site without having to log in. That's what we're going to set up. And then we can adjust our site title. This appears briefly in the browser's title bar before a site page loads. And we'll talk a little bit about how that factors in and other options you have there. So that might be something you want to adjust if you named your site something that's good internally, so you know what it is, but you actually want people to see a different name on your site when they go to the page. We have control over that. Our site was created. I hope yours got created as well. Cool. First thing we're going to do is go into the builder, top left here. Builder is where you get to, it's a drag and drop WYSIWYG. You get to drag components onto pages and you do most of your configuration here. The only other workspace you might need to interact with is administration, at least for basic solutions. They have a couple behind the scenes settings there. So once you get into Builder, we're going to go to this settings menu on the left sidebar here. Here's that public access setting we need to check. So we're going to check guest users can see and interact with the site without logging in. For the site title, you can change that. Maybe something that's like appropriate public site title. That has no impact on your internal name, so you can name that whatever you want. And another thing I'll point out is your site is constantly saving. So it's really hard to lose your work. It automatically saves every time you make a change. So there's no save button, but you will see a publish button, which means it's going to make that available when people visit your site. So you can be making a bunch of changes all day long. It's saving the whole time. It's not until you hit publish that you're actually going to see that on the internet. Okay, that's it for our digital experience. Very easy, couple checkboxes, name it, and we're good to go. So our site has been created. Next thing we're going to do is build our Screenflow, very simple example that collects input. So I'm going to jump back into the Salesforce setup menu. If you still have this workspaces tab open, you can click on that and go to Salesforce setup. Now raise your hand or give me a thumbs up reaction if you've worked with Flow before. Okay, that's good. Hope this part is pretty painless. We're going to go to Flow in the setup menu here. If you haven't worked with Flow, this is a very, very simple example, so there's nothing to be scared of here. We're going to click on Flows under Process Automation. and we're going to go ahead and create a brand new flow. And it's pre-selected for you, but the type of flow we're going to create today is a screen flow so that we can add a screen, get some input, and then do something with that data. So make sure that is selected and hit create. And at this point, I kind of want to talk about some terminology you might be familiar with from other form tools that you've used. What I really want to highlight on this page is you have a lot of this knowledge, you have a lot of this skill, and you have a lot of this competence in whatever tool you might be used to. You can translate that into using Salesforce flows to do those same things. So like form assembly calls this a form and they have pages and you add content and questions to those pages. Form stack has the same thing, forms, pages, but you're adding objects or fields to those pages. Titan Forms has forms again, they have page breaks in order to do new pages and you add elements to those different pages. In Flow, it's the same concepts. We're just using different names for them. So we're going to set up a screen flow. We're going to add a screen for our page, and then we're going to add components like input components to that page in order to collect data. So these are all things you're familiar with. All we're doing is translating to the Salesforce terms for those things. Here's our flow canvas. In order to add an element, there's a little plus sign here. And the first thing we're going to do is add a screen. For the label of your screen, you can call this whatever you want. I'll just call it screen. Under the, I have a couple directions here. Under the footer, we're going to configure our buttons first, since that's the first thing that shows up. There's some default labels in here for pause, previous, and finish. We don't always want people to do all of those actions. So what I like to do is hide previous and hide pause for sure. If you have multiple screens on your flow, you might want to allow people to go back. I don't think I've ever had a use case where pause was useful for me. So I always hide pause. And then this is a handy feature. You can customize the labels for these buttons. So I like to call like a form submission. I like to give the button label the name submit. You can call it anything you want. Confirm or process data or hooray, whatever you want to put in here. That just sort of sets up our page. The next thing we'll do is add a few components. So we're going to add a first name, last name, and email. Our form here is going to create a contact record in Salesforce. So that's all the information we need in order to create a contact. So let's just add some of those components to our flow screen. So over here on the left, you'll see the component menu. There's a ton of stuff you can use. I would just search for the text input. I do strongly recommend using the individual input components. They give you the most flexibility to validate the data, make things required on your flow without having to make them required on your object settings. So this gives you the most flexibility. We're going to drag over one of these text input elements. And for the label, I'm just going to call this first name. You can make this field required. And something I want to stress is whenever you're building these form solutions and they're going to be publicly available, you need to validate the input as much as you can at this stage of the game. What's really nice with this validate input option, it won't let people proceed until they enter valid input. What's important to keep in mind are things like how much text is allowed in a field in Salesforce. Is an email address formatted correctly? Are you trying to follow certain formatting for like a phone number or a social security number? So like making sure you're getting the right input for the field that you're mapping the data to. One thing to keep in mind is for a lot of these standard fields, they don't accept any length of text. First name, for example, only accepts up to 40 characters. These text input elements inside of Flow will accept a default of 255. So what we're going to do is add some validation to validate our first name field to make sure people are entering up to 40 characters and they don't go beyond that. The way we do that is you can put an error message here, please enter up to 40 characters. And one thing that gets a little weird is if you're trying to reference your input field, but you've just created it, you won't be able to find it here yet. So what you can do is click off of that element, either in the header or in the footer, and then click back on it again. And if we go to that validate input, now we'll find our first name screen component field. So all we want to do here is check the length of that field. So I'm going to use a length function. I'm hoping Salesforce will improve this formula picker in the validate input formula section. But for now, that's just len with open and close parentheses. And inside of that, all I'm going to do is specify that first name screen component. And I want to make sure the length is less than or equal to 40. I will point out that the validation features here are sort of opposite of a validation rule in normal Salesforce. This is, you specify criteria for what is acceptable. So I want the length of the first name field to be less than or equal to 40 characters. If you're writing this same validation rule on the contact object, you would say length is not greater than 40. So the reason for that is Flow was originally purchased by Salesforce. It was a separate product entirely. They brought it in. They sort of had all this input validation set up that way, and it's just never been changed. I think it would be crazy to try to change it now. So here's what we got for our validate input. You have the option to add help text if you want a little help bubble to appear. We're not going to do that. Next thing we'll do is add another field for last name. So I'll drag in another text input component. I'll call this last name or surname. You can make that required. And again, at this point, I would you can copy your error message and just tweak it a bit. Last names accept up to 80 characters. So I'll put in, please enter up to 80 characters here for the error message. And for the formula, we'll do the same thing. The length of our last name screen component. Again, if you're not seeing it here, click off that last name field and then click back on it again so it appears. You want to make sure that length is less than or equal to 80. Everybody good so far? Cool. Last thing we'll do is we're going to add an email input component or a place to put an email address. Now, I've had some trouble using the standard email component. It doesn't fully validate the input the way you'd like it to. So people could still enter a bad email address and it ends up being an error, and it's really not worth the trouble of trying to make that work. I hope that gets improved in a release soon. What I've been doing instead is using a text input to collect an email address and then just validating it with the validate input options. So I will call this email. I will also make this required. And there's 3 things we need to do for our email address to validate it. That email field accepts up to 80 characters. We want to make sure there are no commas in the input for that email address. And then I'm using a regular expression to make sure that the email address adheres to a certain format. So we have some characters, we have the @ sign, we have some characters, and then we have a dot, and then we have a couple characters. I'm going to go ahead and put this regular expression into the chat so you can copy and paste that part. I've used this in a number of solutions. The only tweak I've made over the last couple years is making sure there are no commas in the input. I will happily give a Bonus points if anybody can help me figure out why my regular expression is not already validating for commas. So if you can figure out that, please reach out. Let me know. I'd love to pick your brain about how you figured that out. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to first make sure our email input is less than or equal to 80 characters. And I'm going to click off and click back on so that I can reference that email field. For the error message, you can say something like, please enter a valid email address up to 80 characters. For the formula, we'll start the same way we did before. The length formula will reference that email screen component. It's less than or equal to 80. Then I like to do a double ampersand to do additional criteria. You can also expand this if you want to see this section bigger. I'll zoom in too so you can see what I'm doing here. The next thing we'll do is make sure there are no commas in the input. So you can do a not contains. I like to get all of my parentheses in place so I don't forget them later. And I want to make sure my email address input does not contain a comma. So all I'm doing there is putting a comma inside of single quotes. And once I get this all formatted, I'll paste it into the chat too once I get it working if you get stuck. Last thing we're going to do is use a regular expression. So what this does is it compares the input to a pattern, and if the input meets that pattern, then everything's good to go. So this is regex for regular expression. Now I like to just apply the pattern against some like expected data. So we're going to convert the email address to all lowercase. So far I have regex lower, and then I have the email field here. I'll put a comma after that, and then we want to use that regular expression pattern that we found that I've been using. Let me make sure this works, and then I'll paste it into the chat. But you should be having something along the lines of this. Okay, once you have that, you can hit done. Let's just hit save for a second so that we make sure our, I don't know if it'll actually catch it though. We can go ahead and save. So let's call this flow name and a thorough description. Everybody with me so far? Does Flow validate formulas? I don't think it's going to check to make sure my input validation logic is accurate. So we're going to have to test it out. I feel pretty confident about it though, and I did put some notes to myself here to make sure I got that right. So fingers crossed. Live demo. We'll figure it out. Next thing we're going to do, if you have your flow saved, great. We're going to keep adding some things here. This is again where we can translate some of the terminology you might be familiar with. So these other form tools have integrations into Salesforce, or they use a connector, or they push to Salesforce, and then you have a bunch of options to create or update or look up records, find records. All these things are very similar to what Flow gives you. So in Flow, they're called data elements. That's essentially your connector or your integration from your Flow form into your Salesforce data. And once you add one of these data elements to the canvas, you can either be creating, updating, getting, or deleting records. And then as far as what we do with our form inputs, we're just mapping those inputs to different fields on our records. In Salesforce Flow, they call that set field values. So we're just going to add a create records element to our flow canvas to create a contact record using the information that we've gathered. I'll show you how we go through those steps. After our screen, we're going to add another element using the plus sign here. If you search for create records, this is our create records data element that we're going to add to the canvas. Click on that, and then for the label, you can say create contact. How many records to create? We're just going to make one. How are we going to set the record fields? We're going to use all separate resources. So then down here for the object, we get to choose which object we're going to create a record in. So we'll create a contact. And if we scroll down to the bottom here, we're going to set the fields on our contact equal to values from our flow form. So we collected a first name. So choose that field. For the value, you scroll down to your screen components. We're going to select that first name field. Last name is going to come from the last name field. And email address is going to come from the email screen component here. So this is what you should have on your create records element. And once you have that mapping complete, we'll hit done. Now, the last thing we're going to do for our simple example is display a success message. So in other form tools, I actually find this was the most fascinating slide to put together because of the wild names they come up with for displaying a success message. It's either called notifications or emails and actions or on submit. And then you either get to put an acknowledgement, submission message, or confirmation text. All we're going to do in a Salesforce flow is use things we're already familiar with. So we're going to create another screen. We're just going to add display text to that screen. I feel this gives you a lot more flexibility actually to do some pretty cool things because we're able to just add another flow screen and do what we want with it. So that's our last step here. After our create contacts, we're going to add another element and we're going to add a screen. You can call this success message. For the footer, we want to actually hide all of the buttons. Now you have a couple options here for depending how you want your form to end, if you want to let them start another submission or not. But let's go ahead and for our basic example, go ahead and hide all three buttons. We just want to display a message that says thank you. So to do that, over in the component side on the left, we're going to search for display text. This lets you just put in static text. So drag that over onto your screen here. Call this success message. This API name does not allow spaces, so don't do that. I already used that, of course. So success message text. And in here, we can just say, success, your response has been captured. This allows you to format the text. It's a rich text editor, so we can actually highlight everything and center it. We can make it a little bit bigger if we want to. I'll use size 18 font. You can change colors, make it bold, do all kinds of crazy things here. If you wanted to get really fancy, you can use your flow resources. So you could say like, thank you, Evan, for submitting your response if you wanted to insert merge fields here for your success message. All kinds of cool stuff. Once you're happy with this page, that's really it. We're just doing this display text, hiding all of the buttons, and then we'll hit done. The last thing we'll do, oh, the other point I can make here is you could hide all the buttons by unchecking the boxes. We can also just uncheck the show footer option. Get back in there and show you that. Right now there's this gray box at the bottom. If we want to get rid of that, we can just uncheck show footer. Essentially doing the same thing, but let's see how that plays out. So once you have that saved, you can hit save on your flow. Yeah, they do want you to have one of the buttons. So sorry for steering you down that path. I knew that would happen. So what we'll do here is our footer is going to be hidden, but we actually have to have at least one of these buttons here. So go ahead and choose one of the options for like this, the next or finish button to use the standard label. Still not going to show up because our footer is hidden. And now it will let us save. Everybody getting to this point? Cool. So this message is just saying, hey, you can't navigate away from that final screen you just added. We're actually okay with that, and this does not prevent activation. They're just letting you know people who are using this flow are not going to be able to go anywhere once they get to that point. Okay. Last piece we'll do is we need to edit the access for this flow. Now, we've already saved it. If you saved it when I saved it earlier, but what we're going to do is we're going to run the flow in system context without sharing. Yes. So if you got that message about setting allow finish or allow back, let me show you what I did there. On your success message screen where it says configure footer, make sure you use the standard label for the next or finish button, that top option, and then uncheck the show footer box. And once you do that, you should be able to save your flow. Okay. We want to run our flow in a way where our guest users can complete the actions that are there without us actually giving them permission on their profile to do that globally. This is one of the really sort of cool and quirky things about security and flow is you can grant people access to do things only within the context of that flow executing. Salesforce has been going down this path to make things more secure so that you're not granting people these permissions to see contact records, create contact records, but you can still allow them to create a context within the context of a flow. The way we do that is in our properties for our flow, which is the gear icon up here in the sort of top left area. We click on that and we hit show advanced. We can select how the flow runs. And they give you a pretty lengthy description here on the different options that you have. Normal is this user or system context. We have system context with sharing. So if you have a private data model, you can allow people to, create records, but they can only access like contacts that they normally have access to. Or the third option down here is system context without sharing, which means when you're running this flow, the flow can access all data. We're going to use that option for our flow form that we're going to publish on our website. The only change we need to make in the advanced section, so make sure you set that up as system context without sharing, access all data. Click done on that, and then you can click save. You should see this runs as system bubble at the top here next to your flow name. And at this point, we can do one final thing as far as access. We can activate our flow as well too. So back on our flow canvas, let's go ahead and activate. And then if we click the back button here to get back to the flow setup menu, there's one final tweak we need to do because we're going to use this flow in a public website. If if you sort your list by last modified, your flow should show up at the top. Once you see your flow that you just created, all the way over here is this drop-down menu. We're going to click Edit Access. This is very recent. I think it was spring 23. Salesforce required that if you are publishing a flow on a website for guest users, you have to edit the access for that flow and specifically grant that profile access. And the way we enable the first step of that is to click this override default behavior and restrict access to enable profiles. Now, the one thing I find very frustrating about this is they don't expose those site guest user profiles in this list when you're looking at this screen. You have to get to it a different way. So for now, all we're going to do is check this override default behavior and click save. And then we'll come back to this in a second to finish up the last step. Everybody with me so far? Cool. Our last step of our agenda here is to bring two things together. So we've created a site and we've created a very simple flow. Now we're going to add that flow to our experience site. This is essentially the publish step that you would do in a different form tool. I did highlight that so far we've been talking about flow features with this comparing terminology. This is a digital experience portion of our session today. So some of these other tools just have a simple like publish area and then they give you the URL. There are a few steps we have to go through to publish our form on our digital experience site. We're going to go into the builder, create a new page, add our flow component, and then we can publish and get that URL for the form. So let's go ahead and do that. First thing we're going to do on our site is create a page for each form. I like to do it this way because it gives you more options to use URL parameters if you get a little bit fancy with it. It also allows you to have a unique URL for each form that you are publishing on your site. So let me show you how to create a new page in Experience Builder. If you already have that tab open from before where we changed the settings, switch over to your Experience Builder browser tab. If you lost that and you need to get back to it, from the setup menu, search for sites, and you should see under digital experiences, all sites. And once you click into there, you should see a builder hyperlink in order to get to the builder right here. So once you're in the builder, the way we add a new page is at the top here is our page menu. There's a number of default pages that come with every site, like home, they have some login pages, search pages, etc. All the way at the bottom of this list is an option to create a new page. We'll click on that. We'll click standard page on the left here. And I like to just use a new blank page. And what that does is it gives you the option to use this flexible layout. So all I've done is new page, standard page, and then a new blank page is the click path there. And then I choose flexible layout, this first option at the top left. Once you have that, click next. You can give it a name. This is my page name for the form. You can name your page whatever you want. This is going to show up in the title sort of by default, and it kind of works the same like when you're creating your site. This is our internal name. It gets mapped to a couple different places. We can tweak that name to suit our needs. This option here is super handy. You can customize the URL for this page. So if you wanted to have, some specific subdirectory for this page, you can shorten it up, do whatever you need to. This will come up later when we're looking to test our form. Once you have that specified, go ahead and click Create. Okay. Then our next step is we're going to add our flow component to that page. This couldn't be easier. In our WYSIWYG editor here, at the very top on the left is the components menu. In here, we can search for flow. Shows up under process automation. All we got to do is click and drag that flow component onto our page. And all you need to do in this flow properties panel over on the right side is select which flow you want to run. Now, if you haven't activated your flow yet, you'll need to make sure your flow is active. So we should have done that when we were still working on our flow. If you haven't, make sure you click into your flow and click activate. You can also do it from the details over here. All of your active flows will show up in this menu. So I can go ahead and select my flow. I called mine flow name so you know where that label is going to show up. That's it. So we've added our flow to our page. The last thing we need to do is just click publish so that we can see these changes live on the internet. And when you click the publish, it's going to tell you the sort of the domain that the URL for the base of your site. You also get an email when you publish this. So go ahead and hit publish and confirm that we're publishing changes now. Say got it. There's one final thing we need to do, which is that final step of granting access to the flow for our site guest user. The easiest way to get to that profile to make adjustments is from the builder itself. So over here on the left side under settings, in the general area, down at the bottom is the guest user profile. So this was created automatically when we set up our site. If you click on that link to the profile, it takes you to that profile page in the setup menu. And this is the only way I've found in order to grant access to a flow for a specific profile. Once you land on this profile page, the second to last related list is enabled flow access. If you hover over that and click edit, if that's difficult, you can scroll to the bottom of the page. We're going to edit this enabled flow access area. And the available flows are going to be all the ones that we have toggled that option on to override the default behavior, which we've only done for our one flow here. So you should see your flow show up in this available flows, and we're just going to move it over to enabled flows and then click save. Excellent. Now, while all of that was happening, you should have gotten an email that your site is published. Congratulations, your site is published. So the last piece we need to do here is string together our site's base URL with the actual page where we published our form.
Sorry, quick question.
Yeah.
I can't find my guest user profile. Did I miss something? I was setting up a duck race, by the way. Sorry.
No worries. So to find your profile, if you go to the builder in Experience Cloud and click on the setup here, and in the general settings, down at the bottom is the guest user profile. You can click on the hyperlink to that profile.
Thank you. That's where I went wrong. I heard you say this is the only way I've found to do this. And I was like, I've missed something. Thank you.
No worries. Yeah, and once you get over there,
if you're in the setup menu, you can also search for your site name in the setup, like global search thing, and you can find it from there as well.
Okay, that's handy. Thank you. Once you get over to that profile, make sure you go to enabled flow access and enable the flow you created. Okay, so last thing we're do is we can test our form at this point. So we just need to piece together the URL. So I tried to show like, here's that email you get that shows you the base URL. And then when we were setting up our page with the flow on it, here's the URL for that page. All we need to do is conjoin those things together to get the full URL for our form. I like to recommend use an incognito browser or another browser entirely in order to test. That way, you're accessing your site and your flow as a guest user and not your currently actively logged in Salesforce system administrator, which is of course going to have access to all these things. So I'm going to open up a new browser window. In incognito mode. Drag that over here. I'm going to paste in my base URL for my site, and then if you go back to Builder, I'll show you where you can get that URL. I'm still on the page I set up. Under the page properties, that URL we specified earlier is where you're going to want to copy. And again, you can change that URL if you need to. So what you should end up seeing is the base URL for your site /s and then / your page URL. Everybody get to this point, and are you seeing your flow form?
Where do we find the page URL again?
Sure, that is in the builder for the page we set up for our flow. At the top here, this gear icon is page properties. And the URL is the second thing down on this properties tab. So you can copy that.
Okay, thanks, got it.
Sure. Give me a thumbs up or say you got it in the chat if you're seeing your flow form at this point. Cool. Couple thumbs up.
Is there an alternative way to get that front URL rather than through the email?
Yeah, so the other place that shows up is back in the sites menu and setup. So if you search for all sites under digital experiences, this list also has the URL there. It doesn't have the /s, so make sure you get this base URL /s/ whatever your page URL is here. I will make these slides accessible. I'll put the link in the chat and everything, but I do have this that sort of shows you what you're adding together here in order to get your final result.
So I'm getting username, password, login page.
Okay, that's probably because you don't have this URL totally correct. So I would double check it to make sure you're taking what was emailed to you and just adding the /URL for the page that you've set up.
Yeah, I did. I don't know.
The other thing to check is to make sure under settings in the builder that you've granted public access.
Okay.
Mine also didn't work until I used an incognito browser.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I tried to use a non-incognito and it didn't open the page. It just gave me a blank page. I don't know why. But...
Okay. So yeah, double check this setting. Here's your base URL. It has the /s, so you can actually copy it from here as well.
Okay. My public access wasn't set up.
Okay.
Do I need to republish after I make changes?
Yes. So if you do check this box, make sure you hit publish. And it usually is pretty quick. It takes about 8 or 9 seconds to actually publish.
And Evan, is there a difference between, if we look up sites just within the home and setup, we get both digital experience and also the site's domains. Is there a difference between the use of the word sites?
Yes. So under digital experiences, they're calling those sites. That is the new, what used to be called communities. Sites down here is the older, like force.com, what do they call it? Portal or sites.com. It's basically the older technology.
But it's next Friday.
Go ahead, Bobby.
If you click in it though, your Experience Cloud still builds one of those, so that still exists. So when you go in there, you can access the guest user from that as well, and you could also customize it from there. But yeah, it's just easier to do it from Experience Cloud.
Any other questions? Everybody getting to the point where they can test their form? Cool. So you can go ahead and enter some information here. I'll just put mine in. This will be testing to make sure my email validation worked the way I wanted it to. And I'll just hit submit. Success. My response has been captured. I can go back into the Salesforce side of things and go to the contacts tab. And what you should find is a contact record was created. Make sure you toggle your list view to all contacts. And then you should find your contact here in the list. So here's me. That's contact just got created through the flow. Mapped my email address, my first name and last name. All set up here. Created by our site name, site guest user. Again, you can customize the name of that user and that profile once these things are all set up. So you can call it something else entirely.
If I had to change something in the flow, I just got my validation input wrong.
Yeah.
I need to go and make the change and activate. Do I need to do anything on the site?
No. So yeah, that's sort of the cool thing about this. You can make updates to your flow and publish or activate a new version, and that's automatically going to show up on your site. So whatever active version of your flow you have will show up on your digital experience site, wherever it's embedded.
Pass variables to that page, that link. You know, like if I say want to use it for booking campaign members and campaigns and pass in the campaign ID before capturing.
Oh, so you want to add URL parameters?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Let me, Emma, what's our time check here? Where are we at?
We are at 20 past the hour. So I think you've been talking for an hour, right,
okay.
Everybody? So that
Perfect.
means that Evan still has 30 minutes of the stage, I believe.
Cool. Let's get to the next part. So if you're able to test your flow form, awesome. This is a super simple example. And I knew this would happen. We're going to want to talk about all the other things you can do with flow. So this is the cool part where you actually get to decide what are we going to cover in depth next. What I've done is I've set up a flow form as a poll just the other day. So in the chat, you can click on that link and it's actually showing off a couple features that we could talk about if you wanted to. So I used a, here, I'll just open it too.
And then you can show us the flow behind the form, right, Evan? Because
yeah,
that would excite everybody.
I could do that too. So this is a Salesforce's native data table component. I set up a couple records for advanced topics, talking about, you know, is this part of flow or is it part of Experience Cloud? I tried to categorize them into, is this a user experience thing, something you do before the form loads, something you do after the form loads, and then gave you a quick description. There's 13 items here. You can take a read through that, and you can vote on 2. I think with this many people, we'll see what kind of results we get, what people are interested in, and we'll spend a few minutes on the winners.
Have you heard of giving people too many options?
I tried to whittle this down. It's hard. There's so many things we could talk about, you know. Lots of cool stuff we can do. While you're voting, if you have any questions for me in the meantime, you can chat them or come off mute for a second.
Did you include signatures in this?
Signatures, like capturing a signature? Yeah. No, I didn't have that. That's gonna probably involve an AppExchange package. I don't know of a way to capture a signature natively. I tried to stick to advanced topics that I could demo and show you right now without having to do too many installed packages. There are a couple exceptions because they're very common things. I know like our page redirection is going to involve an Apex action, but most of these other things are standard stuff you can do out of the box.
It's a great wish list.
Yes. Thank you.
Evan, are you typically directly processing form responses into objects, or are you capturing form responses in a form response object and then processing that around your system? Because that's the one difference between the packages, the other products you've referenced so far, is you'll always see what the form response was, and then it can go off and take action, right?
Yeah, that is an excellent architectural question. So you can design your form solutions to write all the responses to like a response object, and then set up your actual processing off of those records, exactly as you're suggesting. It's something you kind of have to plan out. I mean, you're going to be executing those things yourself. It is totally possible. What I would recommend for that is set up your custom object. For the processing you're doing on those records, make sure you're running that asynchronously. That is the way to actually get some benefit out of that, so that it's really quick for your form to just submit data into that custom object record, and then asynchronously kick off the processing to go create contacts, update contacts, do whatever it is you want to do. That's absolutely possible.
And in that way, the form submission could be a success, and if there's an error later on, you can just reprocess the form later on.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's the other benefit to that. You could set up a button that just calls that same logic and runs it again once you've made the correction. Okay, I am not surprised by these results at all. Anybody else still voting? Okay. Let me start with pre-filled form using URL parameters, because that's a little bit easier, and then we'll get into this. So, and the pre-filling the form actually is going to cover a couple different things for us. Where is my slideshow?
I would also like to note, if anyone's enjoyed the session so much, I have nothing against asking Evan to come back again sometime. So, you know, if we want a phase 2, feel free to like send messages over any social media about how amazing Evan was. Make Evan feel the love, and then he'll be asking me if he can come back. That'll be even better. I love that. Dodie said it. Evan is the best. Well,
thanks, Dodie. Okay, I do have a quick slide on each of these things, and I'll show a couple examples here. So, pre-filling the form using URL parameters. Yes, you can totally recreate a pre-fill solution using one of these flow forms. A couple things we'll have to do is, I'll show you 2 examples. So first thing I'll do is very simple, like just putting text in the text field, right? So you can use, get rid of some stuff that's confusing here. Too many tabs open. All right. I'm going to go back into my flow. You could follow along, but I'm going to try to go a little bit quick so that we can get to a couple of these other topics. If you want to use a URL parameter, first thing you'll need to do in your flow is set up a resource that can capture that value. That's going to be a variable. I'll set up that variable. I'll call this first name input. This is a text variable. And the one thing we need to do is make this available for input. That setting will allow us to map a URL parameter to this variable on our digital experience site. So once you've got that resource set up, you can hit done. On our screen, if we wanted to use that value in the one of the fields, we need to set it as the default value. One of the other topics you could have voted on was default values. There's a ton of cool stuff you can do with that. just setting static values. You can use values from previous in the flow, or you can just use a variable that you've set up for input, like we're doing here. So once you have the variable set up, available for input, you specify it as a default value for one of your fields. Go ahead and save a new version of our flow, and then activate. Over on the Experience Builder side, we're going to get into the builder and go to the page where you've embedded your flow. I'm actually going to refresh here, make sure that's coming through right. When you click on your flow component, you should now see all of the variables you've made available for input show up, and it lets you map a value into that variable. Now you could do things like static text here. So if I just typed in something, the word static would get put into that variable. If you wanted to use a URL parameter, you just need to specify the name of that URL parameter inside like flow merge field syntax. So I'm going to show you the difference here between the name of my variable in the flow is called first name input, but the URL parameter I'm going to append to my URL is just first name, all lowercase. Whatever you put in here is case sensitive. So if you have capital letters and you get a URL that makes everything lowercase, it's not going to work. So I do recommend using all lowercase letters here for your actual URL parameter name. So once you have that specified, and these are curly braces, so make sure you find that on your keyboard. So it's open curly brace, an exclamation point, the name of the URL parameter you want to append to the URL, and then a closing curly brace. Once you have that set up, go ahead and publish your site again. And if we switch back to our incognito window where we're testing things, we can append a URL parameter. So to start our URL parameters, you put a question mark. We're going to put that same name that we just specified in the curly braces, and then we're going to set it equal to a value. And if we load our form that way, you'll see that whatever I have in the URL here gets put into the form for the first name field. So I can do it for Evan, I can do it for Emma, anything I want to do. That's a simple way to do some URL parameters. If you wanted to do a true pre-fill solution, you can take advantage of the same process, but just use that input variable in a get records. And in that way, we could pass like maybe the contact ID to our flow and have it pre-fill all three of these fields. So let me show you how you would do that. We go back to our flow. I'm going to take away, or I'll end up changing it in a second. I'm going to add an element here and use a get records element. Essentially, this is a data connector, like using prefill in form assembly or some of those other tools. We can say get contact for our get records element. I'm going to search for a contact. I want the ID field to equal our, I'll create a new variable for this one. I'll make a new resource here for, say, variable. I'm going to call it contact ID. Data type here is also text, and I need to make this one available for input. Following along, I hope keep up with that. So here's variable contact ID. I'll hit done. We don't need to sort. We're going to just keep the first record, keep all the fields. Once you have your get records set up with all those default settings, just make sure you're finding the contact with the ID that equals a variable set up for input. We can adjust our screen and set the default values for our fields equal to fields from the contact. So if you search for contact in the default values field, you should see that contact record variable. I can now go grab the first name from that contact, put it in the first name field. For last name, I can set that default value to the contact from my Get records and then map it to the last name field. Email address, I can do the same thing. Contact from Get contact, email address. Now, one thing I'll point out, if you're using this method, anybody who gets a hold of a URL will be able to see the information that you're putting into the form, and it is public. So this is a place where you are exposing data potentially to the world. If they get a hold of a contact ID that they shouldn't have, now suddenly they have somebody's first name, last name, and email. So be very careful with how you disperse those URLs, what information you're showing, and maybe take a second to think about, is this something that's okay to be out in the world? If you're doing it with Form Assembly now, already accepted those risks. So this is the exact same thing. Once we have all of our default values mapped for our fields from the contact record, I'll save this as a new version and activate it. And we'll do the same thing over on the Experience Cloud Builder side. We will refresh that page where we've embedded our flow component. If I click on that, I should see that new variable I made available. And maybe I want to call this just like CID. Again, it can be anything you want. I do recommend you using all lowercase letters. This is sort of defunct now. You could leave both. You could do crazy things where you have multiple input variables and you use decisions and formulas to decide how you're going to use the data based on what you got from the URL. Lots of cool stuff you can do with multiple URL parameters. Let's go ahead and publish this version. And this is a spot where you would use like an email template, or maybe you set up a formula field on a Salesforce object where you can create a URL that's specific for that record, put it in an email and say, hey, can you go fill out your contact profile, make sure we have the right name on file for you, or whatever it is that you're doing. Let's test that out. I'll go over here. And so I would generate that URL, in Salesforce and append the contact ID to it. So here's my contact ID, either in like I said, a formula or maybe in an email template. You would end up constructing something like this, the URL for your page on your site, and then append that CID plus the ID for the contact. When you load that, that will query for that contact record and then map all the fields that you have set up and put them in as default values. Any questions on pre-fill? Okay. See if we've had any updates on the voting here. So Jay was asking, what are the benefits of paying for Experience Cloud logins? I do have a quick slide on that. If you want to be more secure about doing things like pre-fill, I think paying for the licenses allows you to give people a login so that it's not just public information available on the internet. It's only people who, when they log in, they only have access to their information. So that's the main benefit of paying for authenticated users. I have a slide back here in the A's. There we go. The cheapest option you can get is, this is brand new. I have the link down here. I can also put this slide deck in the chat. Should have done that earlier. That is publicly available. You can put comments on there and stay up to date as I make updates to this. There's a new pricing guide that was published not too long ago that has all the recent prices for nonprofit organizations. If you're a nonprofit, you can take advantage of this pricing. For-profit is a little bit more expensive to do these same things. I have done an implementation with a login-based license. And what I learned through that process was when you purchase one login-based license, they grant you 20. So you can definitely factor that into the cost here. And sort of what we did for our client was we bought 2 licenses, and it gives them 40 logins per month, which is generally evaluated on an annual basis. So as long as you're staying within what you've actually been allocated, you can actually do some pretty cheap solutions here for login-based stuff. Now, there are different tiers of licensing. Customer community is sort of the base tier. They don't have all the bells and whistles. They can't run reports. They can't do dashboarding. They don't have access to opportunity object. There's a couple other standard objects like that. If you're just doing some simple flow stuff and you want to give people more tight security around the data they access, it's a great option to set up that licensing. The Experience Cloud for Nonprofit license is equivalent to a partner user license, which grants you all the bells and whistles. So for $1.80 per month per login, which gives you 20 logins that month, you have access to opportunities, campaigns, all the sales objects. You can run dashboards, you can run reports, you can do everything. And that pricing guide is down here at the bottom. Again, that's for nonprofits. The other thing we wanted to talk about is embedding in a website. So this is interesting because that's one of the more advanced things that I have on this list. I will make an attempt to try to explain this as easily as I can. Where's my embedded website? Okay.
Just to jump in, Evan, I mean, I assume people can do a redirect, bit like they do often with form assembly now. So they just put a button on the website with the URL in it. Bingo. Yeah. So just to highlight that, just for anybody who's sort of thinking, well, how do I get it to work with my website? Yeah. Don't necessarily need to embed.
Right. So you can just take this URL, the base URL here for your flow form, and put it as a hyperlink, put it as a button, and that's just going to open that page in a new tab. It's going to load this experience site, and people can complete the form that way. Let me show you an example I did of actually embedding a form in an external site. So what you're looking at here is a flow, all flow inputs, all flow stuff. And when people submit this flow form, it will create an inquiry record in their Salesforce organization. Now, this has a ton of custom styling that was done to it. I just wanted to show you what is possible, and realizing that behind the scenes, this is a Salesforce flow. It's kind of cool. You've done about half the work so far in getting to this point by creating the site and making it available for guest users. You have the URL, you have a lot of the stuff. There are a couple additional steps that can get pretty complicated here. We do need to create a Lightning application. Now it's very simple. I have the entire markup here. The only thing you need to change is the API name of the flow that you want to embed. Once you create that Lightning application in the developer console, the other step you'll need to do is add your website to the domain in the CORS allowed origins list in the setup menu. Over here, if you search for CORS, you need to add your website to this list. It's just putting in the domain name here. The third step for this is you'll end up putting a script on your page that calls the Lightning out resources and then calls this Lightning application that is just running your flow. I know that's a little more complicated than some of the other form tools, which give you essentially a iframe that you can embed, which has pros and cons, I'll tell you. What you're seeing here is not an iframe at all. It's actually creating these elements on this website. So that sort of saves us from going through any sort of wonkiness or security concerns or anything like that. Questions about that?
So in this situation, again, if you had to change the flow, would it pick up automatically?
It does, yeah. That is the nice thing about this. Your Lightning application is just saying, go run this flow with this API name. So if you are just activating new versions of that flow, that component is just going to run whatever is the active version. So it works exactly the same from a development lifecycle standpoint as having the flow embedded on your experience site. That was the main reason for this client we went this route. Was previously we had a solution where we had to go update the script every time we wanted to make an update, and that was becoming too crazy. So we are putting that complexity onto the flow side of things, and the website just says run that flow.
Okay.
I can do conditional visibility really quick. So let's talk about that. This is one of the great things about every one of these input components in a flow has the option to set the component visibility. You can do this based on custom logic here, and it can reference fields on the same page. So if you wanted to make sure that only show the last name once the first name has a value, you could do that. So I'll say only show this last name field when first name, the screen input, is null, false. The conditional visibility is evaluated live, so as you make changes on that same screen, this last name field will show up or disappear as appropriate. So I can show you that really quick. Just go in debug mode, and I will not go in debug mode. I will go ahead and activate and go to, now this is also cool because I still have my pre-fill set up for this. So yeah, there's a value in the first name field, so last name shows up. If I were to blank that out, last name goes away. So that's one cool way to use it, is to have some reaction happening on one screen. The other way you can do it is, say you have a whole section of questions that you only want to ask if somebody checks a box or answers a question a certain way. You can totally create that branching logic. On a single screen, you have the option to add sections. This lets you group together a bunch of inputs. So I could put all of my contact fields into a section, and then the section has conditional visibility. So I have those same options here to say only ask all these contact questions if some other resource in my flow has a certain value. See if there's anything else in my slide that I want to talk about with and or logic. The other nice thing about this is how required fields work. A required input field logic is only required if it's visible. Nice thing about you this can use that to your advantage if you want to required ask, fields work. An optional question like what is your phone number is only required if they are putting in a phone number. You need to know what type of phone number it is. Ask make your phone an optional question like what is your phone number. And if they are putting in a phone number, you need to know what type of phone number it is. That's a really handy way I've used type field, that sort of solution, which is what I have pictured here. Conditionally visible on the right when somebody starts putting in a phone number. That's a really handy way I've used that sort of solution, which is what I have pictured here. Sort of thing to keep in mind, if you want to do that like same screen interaction, make sure you're referencing the actual input field. There are sort of options to keep in mind if you want to do that like same screen interaction. Make sure you're referencing the actual input field. Visibility. There are options to like update it in real input field to if you want that real time. If you're referencing variable reactiveness, make sure you're referencing the actual not getting updated in real time. Get that. So if you want that real time reactiveness,
and
make
because
sure
this
you're
is a regular
referencing
screen flow, you can manage the branching to different screens depending on the responses in the current screen. And because this is a regular screen flow, you
could also do that.
Manage the branching to different screens depending on the responses
you can
in the
set
current
up
screen, right?
decisions. Yeah, you could also do that. So that's another good point. Screens entirely. I could route this decision to decisions. Put some junk here for a second. That's another good point. two different outcomes here. So based on whatever question was asked, I might go to screen 1, or if they answered a different way, I could go to screen 2. Two different outcomes here. So based on whatever question was asked, I might go to screen 1, or if they answered a different way, I could go to screen 2. That gives you a different way to handle requirements like that as well. Cool. I know we're about at time here. I'm happy to take follow-up questions. Please reach out. I have my contact information here. I know we're this was a ton of fun. Again, if you have feedback, this is the first time I've done this follow-up questions. Please reach out. Let me know what went well, what you didn't like here, and happy to. This was a ton of fun. Again, if you have feedback, this is the first time I've done this session. Gave you the confidence. Let me know some of what you know about these other form tools, and happy to improve it. And what is possible. This was helpful building on your Salesforce skills. Gave you the confidence to take some of what you know about these other form solutions in Salesforce. What is possible building on your Salesforce. Thank you so much. It was great to be here, and hope you have a great rest of your form solutions in Salesforce with experience.
Thanks, Evan.
So thank you so much. It was great to be here, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
And thank you so much
Thanks,
to
Evan.
everybody who has come along. Thank you so much. This is Evan. Obviously, the main reason, and thank you so much to everybody to see Evan. Has surely it was just for the swag, right? No, not really. Obviously, the main Evan, you were great. There's already people saying they'd love another session to see Evan. You know, surely it was just for the swag. People, you know where to find me. Not really. Send a message. Evan, you were great. Something there's already people saying they'd love another session. Happy to talk to Evan about coming along again. People, you know where to find me. Yeah, it was a fantastic presentation. Evan, exactly what Evan told me he was going to show about coming along again. He told me this could be done. It was a fantastic presentation, Evan. Exactly what Evan told me he was going to show. Absolutely showed. So he told me this could be done. I think it's going to be a very well-watched recording. So, absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much. I think it's going to be a very well-watched recording. So